Hey, what is up guys, it's Larry, and today I want to talk about what's known as the anchoring bias, which I can pretty much guarantee in one form or another you've definitely fallen for at some point in your life. And if you watch this whole entire video and still don't necessarily believe that you've fallen for the anchoring effect or anchoring bias, then I'll give you a special surprise towards the end of this video. Spoiler alert, it's a thumbs up. So to back up for a moment, what is the anchoring bias or anchoring effect? Well, it's a behavioral bias where we use benchmarks as more heavily weighted than it probably should be when it comes to decisions. Or put another way, when we try to value something, sometimes we use irrelevant pieces of information to value something when we should be using other factors that are more relevant. Think about if you're trying to buy a $10 shirt and you're a little bit on the fence about whether or not it's worth $10, but suddenly I throw up a sign on there that says it used to be $30. All of a sudden this shirt seems like a great deal, and you probably would find that a lot more people would be willing to buy it. You come home, you put on the shirt, and you realize what a great deal this was. You brag to your friends about how you're a great shopper and you're the best shopper out there. But in reality, the fact that this shirt has a sign that says it was $30 is pretty much irrelevant to whether or not it's worth $10. So buying a shirt is pretty much the most common example of the anchoring effect or anchoring bias. But now let's try to think of the anchoring bias example in real life that's probably a little bit more relevant to you. Let's say I'm watching the Weather Channel and they predict that tomorrow it's going to be 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to be clear blue skies. It should be pretty great. But then tomorrow comes around and it turns out to be 50 degrees. And that 50 degrees is going to end up feeling very cold, and I'm going to be very disappointed that it wasn't a sunny, bright day. But now let's say the exact opposite happens, where the Weather Channel predicts that it's going to be 30 degrees Fahrenheit tomorrow, but in reality it ends up being 50 degrees Fahrenheit. 50 degrees is going to feel a little bit warmer than it actually should. Even though in both scenarios it's still 50 degrees, it's still the exact same temperature. One of them is perceived as warmer and the other one is perceived as colder, even though in reality nothing has changed. So a little bit of this has to deal with framing, but the reality is that you're anchoring so strongly to the original predicted temperature that what you actually feel as far as the warmth or cold ends up actually being influenced. Now, another real life example of the anchoring bias would be something like if I were to ask you how many people end up going to the hospital every single year due to paper cuts, you'd probably have no idea what that number actually is, or at least you probably shouldn't unless if you study paper cuts. So in the end, you would assume that's probably a relatively low amount, but what is low can be a little bit subjective. Is 100 people reasonable? 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? What's even crazier is that that number can actually be influenced by something that's completely random. So let's say you're watching a news segment right before I ask you how many people you think every year go to the hospital due to paper cuts, and that news segment says something about 5,000 people buy, the certain brand of soap every single year. You would end up anchoring towards that 5,000 number, even though it has nothing to do with how many people end up with paper cuts. But now let's say a completely different news segment talks about 50,000 units of iPhones had to be recalled because they were defective. You would end up anchoring to that 50,000 number, even though once again it has nothing to do with paper cuts. So that you would end up having a higher estimate in that iPhone situation segment versus in the first scenario, you would actually end up having a lower estimate. So when it comes to the anchoring bias in decision making, why does this all happen, and is it necessarily a bad thing? Well, the reality is it actually comes from good reason, and that's because sometimes it's actually the logical thing to do. Think about if I were to ask you how many cups of soda per day do you think McDonald's sells, but I tell you that 10,000 burgers are sold at McDonald's every single day, then you're probably going to guess that 10,000 cups of soda per day are sold, because that's a logical thing. Most people are buying one burger and one soda with every purchase, unless if you're like me, you buy one soda and 5 burgers. But the problem becomes when you have little to no relevant information to make your decision or guess based off of. So going back to that paper cut example, there's not necessarily anything to base that information off of. Even if I were to tell you how many pieces of paper were sold every single year, that still wouldn't really give you any accurate information to base your decision or guess on how many people go to the hospital every single year due to paper cuts. Or going back to the shirt example, if I'm thinking about buying that $10 shirt, I really don't have any idea as far as how much it actually costs to manufacture a t-shirt. So when I'm trying to decide whether or not $10 is a good deal or not, I don't really know. But if you end up throwing up a sign up there that says, hey, the shirt used to be $30, then I start to believe that actually $10 is a fairly good deal. Never mind the fact that most stores have a huge incentive to basically mark up the original sales price as much as possible. But the reality is there's a reason why stores do this so often, is because it works. Regardless if you even even think the original sales price number is something outrageous. For example, if I'm buying a jacket that is on sale for $50 and the original price is something outrageous like $1,000, I'm still anchoring to that $1,000. I may even discount it in my mind and say, well, $1,000 is outrageous. Maybe it was something like $400, but how did I come up with the number of $400? If the original price was marked as $400, I probably would have said it was something like $200. If it had been $200, I would have said it was something like $70. We can see huge swings in terms of valuation up or down, and we can believe one month it's overperforming and the next month we start to believe that's underperforming, and there's not necessarily any clear indicators on how the company is performing because the benchmark isn't necessarily that great. So the anchoring bias in business is clearly used when it comes to sales price, but it's also used in other ways that you may not necessarily even think about. For example, typically how we evaluate the performance of a company is by benchmarking it to past performance or other companies in the same industry. The other problem when it comes to benchmarking to other companies, or basically anchoring the performance of one company to those of the whole entire industry, is that you end up kind of thinking that something means something when it really has no meaning. For example, if you had 5 different banks out there that basically all ended up making a profit of $1 million per year, but then there was a 6th bank that ended up making a profit of $10 million that year, you would end up thinking that there's got to be some kind of reason why that bank made an abnormal amount of profits compared to the other companies. But every time that you go to this restaurant, you don't end up actually getting that deal. You end up getting enticed to buying this $20 plate of food, and you end up every time leaving that restaurant unsatisfied and thinking you overspent and spent way more than you actually intended to. While it does make logical sense to benchmark a company to other companies in that same industry, it actually does create 2 unique problems. One being that think about a company that is paving a completely new industry and doesn't necessarily have any other companies to benchmark to. We may start to overthink it and basically attribute that the company is overperforming because the CEO is just such a great CEO and that's why the company is racking in, $10 million worth of profit. Or perhaps there's some kind of fraudulent reason. Maybe there's something fishy going on and that's why they're making abnormal amounts of profit. But yet when you just look at that company by itself and basically isolate it and kind of tune out all the rest of the other companies, you actually may believe that the company actually should be making $10 million, or if anything, maybe they should be even making more. Now, none of this is to suggest that benchmarking or anchoring the performance of one company to other companies is inherently bad or that it's always going to be wrong. It can actually have a lot of benefits, but the reality is sometimes it can also lead you down a path that really ends up being a dead end. Is Tesla in the same industry as Ford or Toyota? How do you evaluate SpaceX when there's not necessarily other different private space companies out there? Is Amazon a logistics company or is it more of a tech company? So these things end up becoming really difficult to evaluate certain companies. Now, the anchoring bias in behavioral finance is a real thing too. Think about going to a restaurant and you end up going to the restaurant because they end up having this promo that says, they have this $10 great entree and you believe that's a great deal, so you go to the restaurant. But every time that you go to this restaurant, you don't end up actually getting that deal. You end up getting enticed to buying this $20 plate of food, and you end up every time leaving that restaurant unsatisfied and thinking you overspent and spent way more than you actually intended to. But now let's think about a second restaurant where I don't necessarily have any sales price or any reference point on what I expect to pay at that restaurant. I end up going to the restaurant and end up still spending $20 for my meal, but in this second scenario, I don't end up leaving the restaurant and end up feeling like I ended up overspending more than I thought I would. Now, there's a whole bunch of anchoring bias experiments that are done out there, but I'm just going to mention just 2. One being the most famous one that Kahneman did, which he's a famous behavioral economist. And basically what he did is he took a group of people and had them guess on what was the answer to 9 times 8 times 7, so forth, all the way down to 1. And then he took a second group and asked them the same question, but in a different way. He asked them what was 1 times 2 times 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What he found was that the group where he asked what was 1 times 2 times 3 ended up guessing around 500, 550, versus the group where he asked what was 9 times 8 and so forth ended up guessing about 2,000 or a little bit above 2,000. The correct answer actually ended up being above 40,000, but the point being is that these 2 groups were asked basically the exact same question, but because of how it was framed and they end up anchoring to a certain number initially, they end up having vastly different, almost 4 times as great of a difference compared compared to the second answer versus the first answer. What he ended up speculating why this happened is because you end up anchoring towards the initial math that you do. So in the 1 times 2 times 3 scenario, that ends up being only 6, and you already did a couple of the multiplication that's necessary. But in the other scenario, just initially off the bat, 9 times 8 ends up being a vastly larger number, so you end up building a much larger estimate. The second experiment I wanted to mention was actually an experiment that myself and a group of my colleagues ended up running when we were in college. And basically we ended up taking a bunch of group of random people and ended up asking them different questions that they would have no real way of knowing the right answer. How many different tornadoes happen per year, what the average cost of a house for the whole entire world ends up being, or how many known galaxies are there out in the world. And what we did is every different group, we would end up having a random number generator and end up throwing that number out on the screen. So sometimes it'd be 10,000, sometimes it'd be 2.5, sometimes it'd be 30 billion. And we wouldn't even acknowledge the number on the screen. We would just have it displayed up there. And that still ended up influencing people's answers. So the last anchoring bias example I want to talk about was something as arbitrary as YouTube videos. For example, if you have a huge popular YouTuber out there, talk about something very basic, how to buy a house, and they end up having 1 million views on that video simply because they're a large YouTuber, versus another video that only ends up having 500 views, you would assume for whatever reason that the 1 million view video ends up having better quality for whatever reason, even though in the reality is that maybe you actually have an expert talk about how to buy a house and it's a better quality video, but you don't necessarily end up assuming that. So this is why social proof ends up working so well, right? If you end up having 1 million followers or 1 million likes on something, people end up gravitating towards that and end up liking that more. Now I want to talk about briefly the anchoring bias when it comes to negotiations, because that's a great way on how you can use the anchoring bias to your advantage. Specifically, if you think about salary negotiations, there's been studies out there that have shown that if you end up having a higher initial offer or counter offer to the whatever job is being offered. For example, if I'm offered a job and I say I'm only willing to accept it for 60,000 versus 50,000, there's a much better chance that I'm actually going to end up averaging a better salary versus somebody who doesn't end up having such a high offer. Versus in a different scenario where I basically let the HR person decide the salary range for me. They end up having the initial offer. So now that's kind of my baseline as far as what I'm working with. Obviously, this is kind of a balanced approach, because if I'm working for a job that typically pays $50,000 and I end up saying I'm only willing to accept it for $1 million because I'm trying to anchor towards that number, it ends up being so unreasonable that it's basically just kind of thrown out altogether. But it still actually does have an effect, at least more so than you would if you had thrown out a very low number. The same is true when you're negotiating for a car, and that's why a lot of salesmen will tend to end up having some kind of anchoring effect, whether it be a car on the lot that ends up having a very high price. You can end up having this car that's in the center of the sales floor that ends up being $100,000, and even though they're not necessarily trying to sell that car, because you end up having that $100,000 in your mind when they end up trying to sell you some other car that's $40,000, all of a sudden $40,000 seems pretty reasonable. But if I'm coming from the perspective of I only initially want to spend $5,000 on a used car, then $40,000 actually seems pretty outrageous. So the anchoring effect actually happens a lot more often than you may think. At the end of the day, there's a million different ways on how the anchoring effect or anchoring bias actually ends up influencing day-to-day decisions. And there are definitely ways to combat that, but I'll probably talk about that in a separate video if you're interested in about that. But the reality is there's a whole bunch of different cognitive biases out there that end up affecting our personal finance and our day-to-day life. And if you like behavioral finance or even behavioral economics, those are topics I really enjoy talking about, so consider subscribing to this video. And I'm true to my word, if you really did make it through this whole entire video and you feel that there's never been a situation where the anchoring bias has happened to you, I'll definitely give you a thumbs up, as long as you can return the favor and give a thumbs up for this video as well. So that's it for this video, and as always, if you like economics, behavioral finance, or personal finance, those are things I really enjoy talking about, consider hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you in the next one.